Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session. I am Dave Erickson. I'm the principal at Hillcrest Financial, and this is our seventh Hillcrest Zoom roundtable of the COVID season. We are starting to look at some different ideas to maybe break out of the whole COVID thing. A, because there's just a lot of other great topics out there, and B, we do sense perhaps there is a little bit of fatigue just in regards to this topic. But that being said, we do think that there are still some good things to talk about. So feel free to send us your ideas in regards to things that you might like us to talk about or speakers that you'd like us to have. Just a reminder that today's session is being recorded, and also a reminder to have yourself on mute. If for whatever reason you're not, and we're getting a lot of feedback from your box, we might mute you. So don't be offended if we do that. That's what's happening there. Feel free to ask questions as you like in the chat function. And that's I've just been delighted by that. The interaction that we get from people, not only during the call, which is great. This is designed to be a roundtable talk, but even after the call, sometimes we'll have an email from somebody saying, somebody said this, who was that? Is there a way that I can connect with them? So that's been really fun to see, just the networking that has come out of this. So our topic today is on building and maintaining a strong workplace culture. So whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, your workplace does have a workplace culture, and it's always there. It's this presence that just overrides everything, and all the dynamics of the office and the workplace are into that. The relationships, the reporting structures, even the physical space is part of the workplace culture. Now, I've been told that Hillcrest has an amazing workplace culture, and I'm really grateful for that. But to be honest, I never gave it a lot of thought until the pandemic hit, and I immediately realized that the things that I love about my work, namely being with my team and being with my clients, was all of a sudden in jeopardy. And I'll be honest with you, Monday mornings have been really tough for me through this time. Waking up and contemplating another week of not being able to see my team, not being able to see you guys has been a really difficult thing. So I'm looking forward to this being over with. But at the same time, I'm worried about workplace culture and what this means not only today, but also as people come back. So with that in mind, we looked for a presenter that could talk to us about workplace culture and how to stay engaged with our workforce during this time. So I'm just delighted today to introduce to you Jane Helbrecht. Jane is a partner with Acuity HR Solutions in Winnipeg, my old stomping ground. Her focus is on facilitating Acuity's 4-day intentional people leadership program, as well as other customized leadership training workshops and programs. Jane graduated from the IH Asper School of Business with a double major in human resource management and international business. Prior to joining Acuity HR Solutions, she worked as an HR professional in generalist and manager roles, where she developed her expertise in employee relations, coaching, training and development, and employee benefits. Yay. That was probably the funnest part of her job, I'm sure. So Jane is also very involved in the Winnipeg arts community, including her role as president on the board of the Prairie Theatre Exchange. And please join me now in welcoming Jane. Go ahead, Jane.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am just going to get my slides sharing here. So hopefully you can all see that. If you can't see something, just let me know and throw that in the chat function if you need to. Yeah, we're going to be talking about how to build and maintain a strong workplace culture. We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of the employee engagement fad. I sometimes worry that employee engagement is becoming a little bit of a buzzword, and I think it's still really important and something we really need to focus on as leaders and business owners. And so I'm going to share with you in this presentation the 6 things that we think impact employee engagement that actually don't. And I'm going to share with you the one thing that actually does make a difference. So let's dive in here. I think we've got about an hour of your time today, so I'll make sure that I keep an eye on the time. Please do throw questions into the chat as we go along, and I'll make sure that I leave a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. So research would show that an engaged workforce is a clear competitive advantage. When we look at the data surrounding employee engagement, we see numbers like this. So we typically see that organizations that are in the top 25% of employee engagement results see higher profitability, higher productivity, and they see significantly less absenteeism and turnover, fewer product defects, and less safety incidents by almost half, which is a pretty big margin there. So these are the kind of results that we're getting when we're testing really well from an employee engagement perspective. Maybe some of you, I don't know if you currently measure engagement for your team, but if you do, throw it in the chat. Let me know if you're currently measuring engagement in some way, maybe through surveys or through one-on-ones or something like that. If you have some sort of process in place right now to measure, that would be interesting to know. So as we move along here, we've got some problems when it comes to employee engagement, and that is that we've known since 1999 that employee engagement has a direct correlation with business results. We know that the higher our employee engagement is, the better the results that we're going to get as a business. But interestingly, over these last 20, 21 years, there's been very little change when it comes to the numbers. Overall in North America, when we look at engagement numbers, they've bumped up by like 1 or 2% across the board. So there hasn't been a huge move, even though we know this stuff really matters. And part of that is because I do think that we often focus on the wrong things when it comes to employee engagement. And so the short answer is it's difficult. That's why we haven't seen major changes. Adjusting employee engagement is difficult. It takes time and it takes continuous work. It's not a one-time event. We sometimes think that we measure employee engagement, that we do some things to try and fix some things and then we're good, right? But employee engagement is an ongoing sort of everyday process on the part of leaders and organizations and management. So I'll maybe ask you, just to start out of curiosity, what are some of the things that you think impact employee engagement that don't? Like, what are some of the things you've seen your organizations do or try to impact employee engagement that haven't worked? And I apologize, the chat function for some reason is not coming up on my screen. So Dave, if there's things throwing in the chat, would you mind sharing them? Is anybody sharing anything?
Yeah, for sure. I can do that. There was one that somebody said that they measure through an annual survey.
Okay.
One that I've seen that annoyed me at the time and I didn't think worked, but I was an employee, was we had to memorize the mission statement of the organization.
Had to memorize, so verbatim, be able to memorize and share that mission statement. Okay. So yeah, thinking that everybody can just sort of memorize the statement, but maybe not connect with it, right? Like more about the can you just list it off than actually connecting with it. Okay. So yeah, those are good examples. I'm going to share 6 things, and I'm going to start with one thing I see in a lot of organizations that people try and do to impact culture and engagement, and that is relying on the social committee. How many of you have worked for a company where somewhere along the way, somebody said like, oh, we've got an engagement survey coming up. We've got this thing, happening. Let's have a barbecue before we survey everybody on engagement, right? Let's have a barbecue. Let's have a pizza lunch, something like that. Not saying that we shouldn't have barbecues and pizza lunches. I think those are great, but they don't necessarily impact engagement in a meaningful way. So we've got this guy here who's saying, I don't always eat free food, but when I do, it's because my employer is trying to buy my engagement. And what this really comes down to is that, it's nice to offer some of these things, but they're really kind of perks more than anything else. Because if I go back to work after that barbecue or lunch and I still don't know exactly what's expected of me, or my boss is still kind of a jerk, or there's some person down the hall that's making life difficult for me in a respectful workplace sort of capacity, that lunch isn't really going to have made a difference in how engaged I am in my work, right? So that's something we see. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't have social committees and that we shouldn't have some of that, social aspect of our workplace, but we may find that it doesn't actually impact engagement and results as much as we think it should or could. The next one is we often protect the team from bad news. So sometimes things that we think build engagement would be, you know, we're protecting the team from bad news. We're sort of keeping things close, and this is particularly relevant right now with everything going on in the world with COVID. Right, a lot of businesses have been making lots of really tough decisions over the last number of months, figuring out how they're going to deliver on their services and their products. You know, determining if they can keep all of their staff on board during this time, whether they have to make some adjustments. And one of the things that I've seen with our clients who have managed change very well during this time were the ones that were very upfront versus the ones that were sort of holding everything in. And even with difficult messages, right, of saying like, hey, we're going to do our best. And know that we're doing our very best for everyone. But you should also know these are some of the things we're thinking about. These are some of the challenges that we're currently facing. And so especially during this time, what we're really you know, focusing on with leaders and with organizations is of being able to communicate the reality of what we're currently dealing with, but also being able to do that with confidence that we're going to get through it and we're going to figure things out. But we also don't want to pretend that the reality isn't what it is and that there might be some difficult decisions. And we can see this guy here on the slide is pretty upset about the lack of transparency. He's very upset about the lack of transparency. So we want to make sure that we're sharing more rather than less, especially in times of change. That's super relevant right now. And I know that, you know, things are, you know, especially now that it's summer and, you know, at least where I am, it's a nice day out there. There's a lot of blue sky out there. Things are feeling a little bit more positive, but we also know that things have been changing pretty quickly. Things could change again, right? We could be feeling a bit more positive and then, you know, things could get tough again at some point along the way. We want to make sure that we're prepared and that we're proactively communicating about that. What we know is that when it comes to employees, when it comes to teams, if we don't share the why behind changes, if we don't tell people what's going on and why it's happening, people will come up with their own why, and their own why is always way worse than the actual reality, right? It's sort of human nature with less information to start spiraling and start to worry about, you know, everything that could possibly go wrong, basically. And so really important that we stay on top of that and that we're as honest and transparent as we reasonably can be, you know, given some of the decisions that we're going to be making. All right. Third thing that I see a lot of organizations try to build and increase engagement and also to build and increase culture is we're going to treat everybody the exact same. So we're going to treat everyone the same. And when I think about this, I sometimes think about the golden rule, not actually this golden rule that's on the slide right now. This is a different golden rule. But I think about the golden rule that is the, you know, treat others the way you want to be treated rule, right? And when we think about how we treat people in the world, often that's a very good rule to employ. The thing that's really interesting about a workplace is, like, we know the people we work with pretty well. And so I think the golden rule works well for me with people I don't know, right? If I'm just out in the world, treating somebody the way I would want to be treated with very little information seems like a good move. But because I know the people I work with very well, I actually want to pivot a little bit. And so we now use something called the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is to treat others the way they need to be treated or the way they want to be treated to be successful and thrive at work. It's recognizing that the golden rule kind of makes us look at everyone else through our own lens, through who we are, what our preferences are, and puts that on other people, which isn't necessarily what's going to make somebody engaged at work or feel better about being at work, right? I want to play to everybody's strengths. I want to figure out who people are and how they can succeed at work. One of the examples I often think of here is I think of like people with kids. Right? So if you have kids, do you treat your children the exact same way? Generally, when I have people in a big in-person group, pretty much everybody goes, nope, they're different kids, they need different things, right? I'm not a parent, but I have nieces that I spend a lot of time with. And when I think of my two nieces, I think of the older one, Joy, who's now 7. And Joy is very tentative. She's very shy. If Joy and I are going to go on an adventure, we're going to talk about like where we're going, what we're doing, who's going to be there, every detail. She wants to feel prepared. Her little sister, Beth, the first sentence that Beth ever sort of constructed was, I got it. If I started to walk Beth through every detail of where we're going and what we're doing, Beth's going to be like, Annie Jane, it's cool. I got it. Right? And so I'm going to treat them differently based on who they are. And that also applies at work. One of the examples I often think about is often talk about from a leadership perspective, the idea of people who are sort of speak to think versus think to speak. So people, I would classify myself as a speak to thinker. I am somebody who, in order to solve a problem, in order to figure out how I feel about something, I have to talk about it. That's how I process, is by talking, right? So I think my boss, Brad, the president of Acuity, I think he knows that half the time I have a problem, I'm gonna come into his office, I'm just gonna like download, and then I'm gonna come up with my own solution. And at the end, he's just gonna be like, yeah, cool, do that. Like, I don't actually need any help, I just need to talk it out. Right? But I have other people on my team, my colleague Devin, who is absolutely a think to speaker. And she is someone who wants to sit back, take in all the information, and then when she's ready, she wants to share, but she wants to process internally. This means that we're maybe, treating each other differently, right? It means you can throw something at me and I'll be ready to share right away. But with Devin, I want to get information to her a bit more in advance, give her time to process and think before sharing in a meeting. She's going to find it harder to contribute sort of off the cuff. Neither of these things are wrong or right. They're just different. And it's a way to apply that platinum rule of saying like, okay, who are you and what you need to be successful at work? Now, of course, there's a little bit of a risk sometimes when we treat people differently at work, and I'm sure you're thinking that a little bit, and that would be the idea of favoritism, right? If we're treating people differently, we're at risk of maybe being accused of playing favorites or something like that. I'll be honest with you, I think as an organization and as a leader, if you're not being accused of playing favorites sometimes, you might not really be making some tough calls from time to time. But here's what's really interesting about favoritism. Often we favor the wrong people by not dealing with problems, right? So every time I let the person who's got a bad attitude and who's being, rude to other people keep behaving that way, I'm favoring them. Every time I let that person not meet deadlines or not show up to certain meetings or not holding somebody accountable, I'm favoring them. And so I would never suggest that any leader go out of their way to favor anyone over anyone else. But I would say, if anyone's ever going to accuse me of favoritism, I want my rude, bad attitude, underperforming people to be complaining that I treat my most committed people like gold. I can live with that. I cannot live with my best people on my team complaining that I'm letting that jerk get away with being a jerk, or that I'm letting that person continue to not contribute the way they need to the team. Right? And so it's interesting when we think about favoritism, because often we actually favor people by not taking action, right? And usually when that happens, we're not favoring the right people. And so when I think about favoritism, I often think about one of the first jobs I had out of university, working in manufacturing. And I was like 22, first job, and just out of university. And I was sitting in the cafeteria with a couple of women that I worked with, and they were complaining about our leader at the time, Brad, who I actually still work with now. We've continued to work together over the years. And this person was complaining and saying, oh, Brad is really favoring this person on our team. He's favoring, we'll say Lisa, we'll call her Lisa. Brad is really favoring Lisa. And everybody was complaining about it. They were like, she gets the best projects, she gets the juicy workplace investigations, which as young HR professionals, you just wanted to get your hand on a juicy investigation. These days, I'm like, I don't want to know, don't tell me. But that's what you wanted when you were just out of school. And they're complaining about Brad. And I said, you guys, you know why Brad is favoring Lisa, right? And they thought they were in for like some pretty good gossip or something. And I'm like, the reason Brad favors Lisa is because she's awesome. She's better than we are. Like, she's just better at her job. She's more mature. She's better able to handle these investigations. I know I'm not probably mature enough to actually take these investigations on. I don't think I have the maturity or presence of mind to handle these. Some of the people that were complaining about it, I was like, you go for drinks with some of these people after work. You can't do an investigation on somebody you interact with socially. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? But when you think about that kind of favoritism, it was the right kind of favoritism. It was recognizing that somebody's great at their job, and as a result, they maybe get some interesting work or some interesting projects along the way. So, we don't want to be unfair to anyone. We're not actively trying to play favorites, but we don't have to worry so much about treating everybody the exact same way, because that really doesn't allow people to thrive and succeed at work either, and it certainly doesn't do anything for engagement. Now, the fourth thing that I'm going to mention here is focusing on fixing employees' weaknesses. So as leaders and as organizations, one of the things we do to try and fix engagement issues, to fix our workplace culture, is we focus on everybody's weaknesses, what they're struggling with, right? And we've got Michael Scott here saying, my weaknesses, I just care too much and I try too hard. Those are his weaknesses. I'm actually talking about the real kind of weaknesses, right? Which is like, maybe somebody who's not detailed, right? And that's a weakness for them. Maybe somebody who really doesn't like presenting in front of people and gets really nervous and uncomfortable, and it's just not something they want or like to do, right? We actually, as organizations, from an engagement perspective, will always do better focusing on people's strengths. So instead of trying to fix or change people, I can kind of accept what people aren't great at and say like, okay, but like, what are you great at? And how can we do more of that? Do we have the opportunity here to shift things around a little bit? When we think about the room for people's, or the, sort of the greatest room for growth with most people, it is actually in the direction of their strengths, not their weaknesses. I'll give you an example. I would say that I'm not an Excel person. I know you're like, you have benefits experience. How can you not be an Excel person? That's why I'm no longer a benefits person. But yeah, I would say I'm not a great Excel wizard. I can work in something that's already created and whatever, but I am not the person to be like, oh, there's all this data that's coming in. I'm going to build some sort of amazing, system in Excel to make this work. That's not my skill set. It's not my strength. And you could give me all of the training, all of the support on how to better work in Excel. You could give me all the tools, all the books, everything. I'm still going to hit a bit of a ceiling because it's just not how my mind works. The organizing data, solving puzzles, like that's not how my brain works, right? So I'm going to hit a ceiling. But on the things I'm really good at, where I maybe have some strengths, well, sky's the limit in terms of where I can take that with more training, more support, more time, right? But for many of us with weaknesses, if it really just isn't how our brain works, if it's not how we think, we're going to hit a bit of a ceiling there. And so when I think of benefits specifically, years ago, I remember working in an organization. It was a financial organization in Winnipeg, and I was responsible for reconciling, a spreadsheet every month, reconciling benefits, deductions and benefits premiums. So were we collecting enough deductions and our premiums? Was this all reconciling? And this stupid spreadsheet would be out by $2.75 or something like that. And I would think about how I know people in my life that would find great joy in finding that missing $2.75 and digging in and solving that problem. And, me on the other hand, I once just like gave our CFO a $10 bill. And I was like, I'm not looking. This is not the best use of my time, right? My colleague Devin came on and joined that organization. She took over that spreadsheet and she killed it because that's how her brain thinks. That's how she works. She's an Excel-minded, numbers-minded puzzle solver, problem solver, right? She loves troubleshooting. She loves figuring things out, finding hacks to make things better. She probably got that spreadsheet way more organized than I did. It probably was always reconciling without $2.75 being off, because she found ways to make it better and to make it work that I couldn't do, because it's really hard to adapt and troubleshoot when you are not playing to your strengths. When we play to our strengths, we have a much easier time adapting and troubleshooting along the way. So I would say, don't focus too much on people's weaknesses, instead focus on their strengths. And from an engagement perspective, you'd actually see that the questions that are considered sort of at the forefront of employee engagement, they're Gallup questions. Some of you might be familiar with them. They're called Q12 by Gallup. And one of those questions is something like, do I get to do something that I do best at some point every day? That's one of the 12 questions. So that's really about this weaknesses versus strengths piece, right? It's making sure that every day people come to work and get to focus on something that is a strength that they do best, that they feel really good doing. Maybe they don't get to do it all day, every day, but at some point every day they get to, dig into something that they're good at, that comes naturally, that they can do best. Number 5, another thing that we do to try and impact engagement or sometimes workplace culture is we throw money at the symptoms. So we've got Leonardo DiCaprio here, sort of just throwing some money out there, throwing money at the problem. Money is interesting as a motivator because it does work as a motivator in some ways, but not always the ways that we think it does. So money matters, but only to a point. And I occasionally am working with clients or different people who say like, hey, we've got this person, all of a sudden their engagement and motivation is sort of waning. We think we're going to like give them a raise and a few things to just like try and get them back on track. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's get them back on track. And then let's reward them with the raise or the bonus or whatever it is, right? But doing that in advance isn't necessarily going to drive better performance. And part of that is that money matters if you're not making enough, right? Or if you're being paid unfairly. So like if I work in IT and everybody else in my type of role in my organization or in my industry is making $70,000 a year and I'm making 55, well, that's going to have a negative impact on my motivation because I'm not being paid fairly, right? But if I'm being paid fairly, money isn't quite the motivator that we think it is. So especially once we get to a certain level of income, money is going to be a motivator if somebody's earning, $25,000 a year potentially, because getting an extra few $1,000s has a really big impact on their ability to live their life and do some of the things they want to do. But once you get to a certain level, that changes a little bit, right? And so we don't want to just throw money at the symptoms. When you look at engagement questions, and again, those top 12 questions by Gallup, money isn't one of them. So money and compensation doesn't actually break the top 12 of what's considered to be the most meaningful engagement questions that are out there. So that's important to note as well. The sixth thing we do when it comes to employee engagement that doesn't actually work is we assume employee engagement is about employees. I actually don't think employee engagement has all that much to do with employees, and I'll sort of get to that in a moment. I just want to recap on what we do here that doesn't work. So, we've got this guy here too who's saying like, yeah, if you could just be a little less honest on the employee engagement surveys, that would be great. Sometimes that's a challenge with engagement surveys or measuring engagement is people aren't always honest, right? Or, if they're filling out surveys that might get them onto a list of some sort as a top something, sometimes there's a different motivation to answer those questions a little bit differently. So things that don't work. We don't want to rely on the social committee for engagement and for culture. We don't want to protect the team from bad news. We want to be honest and transparent, at least as much as we can be. We want to recognize that we shouldn't treat everyone the same, that we should play to people's strengths based on who they are. We shouldn't focus on weaknesses. We don't want to throw money at the symptoms, and we have to recognize employee engagement is not actually about employees. So I'm gonna build on that here, and I keep looking at this one slide every time I do this presentation. I keep needing to change it because it's a little bit of a contradiction. It's like there's no silver bullet when it comes to employee engagement, but what's the one thing that makes all the difference? Seems a little bit contradictory, but really it's leaders. The biggest factor in culture and engagement is leadership, period. Employee engagement results don't tell me about employees. Employee engagement results tell me about leaders. They tell me about what leaders are doing well, what leaders are struggling with. They're almost like a little bit of a review on leaders, especially if we're asking the right kind of questions. And so when we think about engagement questions, sometimes you'll see an engagement survey that has just a ton of questions, and they actually relate a little bit more to employee satisfaction than they do engagement. So if a survey asks something like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like our corporate sustainability program here at this organization? That doesn't tell me about engagement. It tells me about whether somebody cares about corporate sustainability or not, and whether they think your plan in your organization, meets whatever needs or expectations they have. It doesn't tell me about how engaged somebody is. So sometimes we're asking the wrong questions as well. But I do believe leaders are the biggest factor in employee engagement. And John Maxwell would say that the single biggest way to impact an organization is to focus on leadership development. And so some further stats to sort of reinforce this. 84% of how people feel about their workplace is directly related to the relationship they have with their leader. Their leader is the biggest factor. When you look at the Gallup Q12 questions, almost all of them go back to leadership. So they're going to say things like, do I have the training to do what I need to do? Do I have the work expectations? Like, do I know what's expected of me? Does my leader say thank you? Does my leader give me recognition on a regular basis? Does my leader value my inputs and my contributions? Those are the types of questions that are included in that Gallup survey. And so much of this goes back very specifically to the relationships that people have with leadership. And I think most of us, if we were to think about a time we were at work, maybe in a past workplace where we weren't engaged, and you think back to what was causing that lack of engagement, most of us, most of the time, would say it's something that our leader could have adjusted or changed. That it's something that had to do with something going on in the organization that we didn't feel our leader was on top of or managing or taking care of for us. That's often what it goes back to. And so what happens when we don't invest in leaders? Well, ultimately, you've probably seen this before, ultimately people leave bad managers, not bad companies, right? And this one's a tough one, but I do think that leaders usually get the employees they deserve. And that's on the good side, and that's on the not so good side, right? So we've all been in a situation where we've, maybe hired somebody and it just wasn't going to work out despite all of our best intentions, right? We've all probably had that at some point along the way. But when we see a pattern in a team or an organization, when we see a higher level of turnover, when we see people start highly committed on day one, and then we see that commitment start to sort of shift downward, we have to consider what's going on there. And often it does go back to the leader. Now, sometimes there's some other factors at play. I was with a client last year that was in an industry where they were paying a few dollars less an hour compared to virtually every one of their competitors. They also had more physical work than most of their competitors. So employees were being paid a couple bucks less an hour, plus they had to do a lot of lifting and sort of difficult physical work. I'm like, yeah, that's a challenge in terms of retention. But the thing that was interesting about that is there were still leaders and teams that, despite those challenges, didn't have high levels of turnover, were able to keep people on board and engaged, right? Because it went back to the environment that leader was creating. And one of the challenges that we run into is that most leaders are really good at getting stuff done. They're really good at managing resources, budgets, schedules, all of these other things. But we don't really manage people, we lead them. And when we just kind of manage people, we tend to get a lot of compliance. When we lead people, we get commitment. And what we're going for is commitment, because commitment is engagement, right? It's that high level of engagement. And so that is the real differentiator. And when we think about leaders being the differentiator for engagement, they're also the differentiator for, I believe, culture. And there's a lot of different ways you can sort of define or think about what culture is in a workplace. But in the truest sense, what I think culture is just how we do things day in, day out as a team or as an organization. We all say lots of things about our workplace culture. But what the actual culture is how you get things done day to day, how you treat each other while you get things done, how you set expectations, the actions you take, the decisions you make, how those things are communicated. That is your workplace culture in actual practice, right? And again, that often goes back to leaders sort of setting the tone in terms of how we do things as an organization. So I want to share some things that people leaders do to build engagement. I apologize here, for some reason I can't get the chat to actually stay up on my screen. So Dave, if there's been any questions or anything that I should be aware of, let me know. Sure, I keep clicking it, and then I bet it is behind another screen somewhere on my computer. Sure. Is there? There you go. You know what? I just found it. Let's see if that'll stick around. So I see somebody said they moderate or they measure, sorry, through an annual survey. So somebody did let us know that they are currently participating in an annual survey. So what I want to do now is I just want to share with you some of the things that I think great leaders do. Oh, I've got a question here. Okay. Can you please elaborate on your comment of needing to invest in leaders? Are there any leadership development programs that you'd recommend? Yeah, so I can absolutely elaborate on that. And maybe what I'll do, that comment was from Megan. Maybe what I'll do is I'm going to go through this next little bit because it's going to be specific around what I think great people leaders do. And as we sort of come through this, I'm happy to, either make some recommendations, privately back to you, Megan, or to everyone. But here's a few things that I think you want to be aware of from a people leadership and engagement standpoint. So if you are somebody in your organization that leads a team, or if you are responsible for leaders in your organization, these are some of the things that you want leaders to be doing and that you want to coach and train and support leaders in doing. So number one, I think, is probably the most important, and that is to make time to lead. So I believe that great leaders who can focus on engagement, who can make real shifts around the employee engagement of their team, they have to make time for it. They have to plan and prepare for it, just like they would for any other major deliverable or objective on their plate, right? I put time aside in my calendar for everything important. But how many of us as leaders also put time aside in our calendar every week, every 2 weeks, to sit down and think about our team? Who's doing well? Who's struggling? What do I need to do to sort of turn this around or to increase engagement? Great leaders, one of the common factors is that they typically reflect and experiment. So they're always reflecting on what's happened, what's working, what's not working, and then they experiment and try new things, right? That's really hard to do for many of us if we're not setting aside time. So many of the leaders that I work with one-on-one, one of the first things we do is we actually get them to put 30 minutes in their calendar as a recurring meeting every single week, where they sit down and think about their team and they plan for the week moving forward. What big milestones are going to happen? How am I going to recognize those things? What tough conversations should I be having? Things like that. So making time to lead is going to be really important. It's recognizing that people leadership isn't something we do off the side of our desks when we have time, that it's actually the best investment we can possibly make in our business and in our team. People leaders, great people leaders who build engagement, also care about both performance and professional health. So we care about getting results and people performing, but we also care about this professional health side of things, which ultimately is how people feel about being at work, right? Recognizing that we want people to come to work feeling good about being in this environment, feeling like they know what's expected of them, they know they're going to be respected, all of these other things, right? Some of you maybe have experienced this, or maybe you know somebody who's experienced this, but somebody who gets the Sunday night blues about the fact that they have to go back to work on Monday morning, who starts to get stressed out, right? We don't want to be in an environment like that. And so when we think about performance versus professional health, I sort of look at it like a bit of a balance. I want these two things to be in balance. I can't ask so much of performance that I sacrifice how people feel about being at work. I also long-term may not be able to focus on how people feel about being at work at the expense of performance. I need to find a balance. And there might be times where that balance is a little bit off, but over the course of a year, I kind of want to find that balance, right? And part of that professional health relates back to benefits, right? So it's going to be, what mental health supports do we have in place? What kind of EAP programs and things like that are we providing for employees so that they feel good about being at work, that they have the support they need? Other things that great people leaders can do to build engagement is they connect employees to that vision and purpose of the organization. So, Dave used the example of just memorizing it, but let's actually help people understand and connect to it in their own ways, right? Maybe the way I connect to our Acuity purpose might be a little bit different than somebody else in our organization. Doesn't matter if they're the exact same. What matters is that we connect to it, right? Great leaders are asking for input. They're asking for opinions. They're getting people to weigh in. They're collaborating. Really important, recognition. They're giving meaningful, regular recognition. Most of the engagement research out there would show that leaders need to be giving meaningful recognition on pretty much a weekly basis. So when you look at employee engagement surveys, often there's a question that says something like, in the last 7 days, has my leader recognized me for good work? It's not in the last 6 months, it's not in the last year, it's in the last 7 days. So we need to be looking for opportunities as leaders to give really regular, meaningful recognition. And I think really that, it doesn't have to be awkward one-on-ones, like it can be a nice email to somebody, right? Or it can be passing along nice feedback from a client or from somebody else. It doesn't have to be in front of big groups of people. Like we don't have to make a big show of it all the time. It's really just adding 20 seconds on to a thank you to say, hey, thanks for doing that thing. This is why it mattered, right? Often when I talk about recognition with leaders, they're like, oh man, every week, that's a lot. Like that feels like a lot of recognition to be giving. And so it's important, it has to be genuine. It can't just be checking a box and just doing it because you're supposed to, right? It has to be meaningful. But at the same time, there's no such thing as too much recognition as long as it's genuine. Right? I've done hundreds of exit interviews for employers where I've worked for them or for clients on behalf of clients. Never have I ever had a exit interview where somebody was like, you know what? My boss was just like too appreciative of my work. They just like thanked me all the time. I had to get the heck out of there. Right? I have heard a lot of people say, I didn't hear anything one way or the other about my work. I didn't hear if I was doing a good job. I also didn't hear if I was doing a bad job. I've heard a lot of people say that, right? I've heard a lot of people say my leader only talked to me when they had bad news or a tough message, right? Part of the reason recognition matters is because I do think it plays into a little bit of psychological safety as well. When people are hearing that you see what they're doing and that they're on the right track, they feel safer at work, right? Okay, like people see that I'm doing things and I'm doing the right things. Right? And I think that does make people feel like they know where they stand at work. And that does matter when we think about that safety piece of things. I mean, we talk about physical safety, we talk about psychological safety, but what we know is when people don't feel safe at work, they kind of tend to go into self-protection mode. And self-protection mode tends to look like throwing other people under the bus, blaming everybody for other things, taking credit for every little thing you can do, basically just like protecting yourself, right? When we feel safe at work, we take ownership when we made a mistake, we give credit where credit's due, and we look out for the team, right? So part of this recognition piece is making people feel safe enough to know that they're seen, that we see the good work that they're doing so that they can make sure that they're looking out for the best interests of everyone and not just themselves. Next one here was to play to employees' strengths. That relates back to that point of not focusing too much on weaknesses, but really of looking for opportunities to even, shift work. Like if you have the flexibility as a team, depending on your organization, to actually say like, let's do an inventory of everything we need to get done and an inventory of everybody's strengths and talents, and then let's assign work from there. I have an accounting manager that I did some work with a while back who did that. She did that inventory, she figured out everybody's strength, and she blew up the job descriptions and she just assigned work based on strengths. And the interesting thing for her was all of the other problems with her team seemed to go away. Attendance issues went away. People getting in each other's business about what they were working on went away. Because when everybody was playing to their strengths, people didn't worry about what everybody else was doing. People were happy to show up to work on time, right? So a lot of the other team dynamics that she was struggling with actually went away when she started playing to strengths. Few more things here. So a few more things that great leaders do to build engagement. They have the tough conversations when they need to have them, the feedback conversations, the performance conversations. They're transparent. They build individual relationships with people on their team, right? They recognize that, sometimes they're leading the group, but the way that they really effectively lead a group is by building relationships with each person on their team. They invest their time wisely. They get that their people are the best investment in their business, that all of the results that we're trying to deliver are done through the people on our team, that they're our most important resource, and they're highly intentional. So great people leaders are really intentional about how they lead, what they say, how they assign work, how they have recognition conversations, how they have tough conversations. A phrase that I've heard before that I think is actually from a Calgary-based organization called the Humphrey Group. They talk about how important it is to speak as a leader. And one of the things they say is that every single time you're communicating as a leader, there's really only 3 outcomes. You're either building a relationship, maintaining a relationship, or destroying a relationship every single time you communicate with people at work. So if we know that those are the outcomes, we know we need to be intentional to make sure we're at the very least maintaining, and wherever possible, that we're building. I also think that great leaders know and recognize that they are a differentiator in engagement. They have to know that they're a factor, and that if they want to see different results in terms of those employee engagement results, that there's a lot of work they need to do. It's not about just changing employees. It's about looking at how we connect, how we influence, how we set expectations, and all of these other things to impact those employee engagement results. I see that there's another question here. So it says you're maybe going to talk about this, but how are people leaders needing to adapt in the COVID era? This is really interesting because we've done a lot of training on leading remote teams, leading through crisis. Was doing a lot of that, back at the end of March and in early April. It's quieted down a little bit now that we've adjusted. But the thing that's really interesting is that the fundamentals of this stuff doesn't change. We just have to be even more intentional. All of the stuff that we're talking about here still needs to happen. We have to work a bit harder for it, right? If I want to be giving recognition on a weekly basis, well, it's easier to do that when we're all in the office and I see these organic interactions, or I overhear conversations and I can say, hey, I heard you on the phone with that client, or I heard you on the phone with that person. Like, thank you for taking that on. You really took time and care to chat that, with that person through their problem. Well, I don't hear that now that they're working from home, right? I'm gonna have to work a little bit harder. One of the things that I think can be really helpful if you are working remotely is to make sure that you're having really regular one-on-ones with each of your direct reports. So I would suggest most leaders have a one-on-one touch base once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, depending on the dynamic of your team. And in a one-on-one like that, even if the only questions I ask are like, how you doing? What was your biggest accomplishment this week? What was your biggest challenge? And what do you need from me? Like, if those were the only 3 questions I asked in every one-on-one, I would get a ton of information, and I'd probably get some information around how I can give feedback, because somebody will say, oh, this is what I accomplished last week, and I'll say, oh, I didn't even know that happened. Thanks for taking that on, right? So it's giving me some data and some information to be able to give recognition. I see a bit of a follow-up question here. It says, do you feel that performance evaluations are good for engagement or bad? That is a really good question. I could probably talk about that for an hour on its own. It really depends on the performance evaluation process in your organization. I think that performance evaluations can be good for engagement. I think they can be good in particular if they're forward-looking, they're talking about growth, opportunities to leverage people's strengths more. So I think they can be really good for engagement, particularly if that leader and employee already have a good relationship and we're really just working towards, okay, how are we going to grow and build even further. Where they're bad is any sort of performance evaluation process where we save up the good or the bad news for the evaluation. Performance evaluations should really be a review of all of the stuff that you've already covered with people. There shouldn't really be any new information being shared in a performance evaluation, because you should be having those tough feedback conversations when they're timely all year long. There shouldn't be any surprises, right? So if there are surprises, especially bad surprises around performance in a performance evaluation, I can guarantee that will have an extremely negative effect on that individual's engagement. But if you're using performance evaluations as a tool to be forward-looking, help people reach their personal and professional goals, I think they can be great for engagement. So it probably depends a little bit on the process in an organization and how it's approached. All right. So what should we consider during times of crisis when we're working with a remote team? Just to build on that a little bit more, it's recognizing we have to do all of this stuff. We have to be even more intentional about it. A really big piece of it too is to get on Zoom or on Microsoft Teams or whatever platform you use and make sure that you're seeing people's faces. So if you're having a tough feedback conversation, get on screen, make sure you can see each other. People can read tone, they can read your facial expressions in those cases. That matters. The research also shows when you think about remote employees, that people tend to trust and like people the more they see their faces. It's something called the mirror exposure effect. So making sure that you're getting on to some sort of platform where you can video chat on a somewhat regular basis is really important, because it will have an impact on trust, which will have an impact on engagement as well. So I would say when it comes to remote work, all of the foundations still apply. We just have to work a little bit harder. Now, I think what we have to recognize is that if achieving results is important to you and your organization, employee engagement must matter. It's not going anywhere. It's not a fad. It's sticking around, right? We might end up calling it something different at some point, but employee engagement matters. And we know it matters because we're getting these kind of results, right? And imagine what you might be able to get done as an organization if all of a sudden you were significantly more profitable, more productive, if you had fewer, safety incidents, less turnover, things like that. Part of the reason that this is so hard, and I think where most of us struggle a little bit, is that, again, this is a constant, everyday, ongoing process. And not only is engagement a constant, everyday, ongoing process, but leadership is. So, sometimes people think like, oh, I've gotten to this point where like, I'm just a leader now. Like I just lead. Leadership just manifests off my body. I don't even have to try anymore. That doesn't actually happen. All of us are going to have good days, like parenting probably, right? Like where you're going to have good days and you're gonna be like, oh, I nailed it today. Like that was a really good day. And then you're gonna have a next day where like something smacks you in the face and you're like, okay, that was not a good day, right? So when it comes to leadership, we're going to have days where we, take a couple steps forward, and then another day we take a step back and we take a few more steps forward. It never ends. We always have to work at it. And in fact, employee engagement, the better your engagement results, the harder it is to bump it even 1 percentage point higher, right? The higher your engagement results, the more you have to work at it to maintain your engagement results, right? Because now people have high expectations of you. If you're getting great results and employees are engaged and happy, they continue to expect that from you. I'm really fortunate. I work with a really wonderful team, and I would say our team is extremely engaged in the work that we do, but I always joke with Brad, my boss. I think my Christmas card to him this year said something like, hope you have a great holiday season. Sorry for being so high maintenance. Because he's a wonderful leader. And so now we expect a lot of him because he's done a great job, right? And so the expectations can just become higher sometimes. Now, I want to just cover briefly what you can do in your organization and from an HR perspective or from a leadership perspective to have a real impact on employee engagement. There's a couple things I think we can do. First is, if we're in the HR realm, to make sure that we're hiring great leaders with strong people leadership skills and good character. We want decent humans to be responsible for other humans, right? Like we want people who care, right? And it doesn't mean like fluffy rainbows and unicorns care. That caring might look really different leader to leader, but we do want leaders that care about the people that are on their team. We also may want to get non-leaders out of leadership positions. Sometimes we end up in a situation where somebody is now responsible for leading a team and they were a great individual contributor, but they are really challenged with leading people and it's maybe really not a strength for them. It's a weakness, right? Make sure that we're making those adjustments because it's too important, right? Leaders impact engagement to the extent that we cannot have leaders continue in positions where they're driving engagement down, where they're having a negative impact. Provide leadership support and coaching to people in your organization, to leaders in your organization. Not many people are just natural leaders. Most people do have to work at it a little bit, right? So make sure that we've got those supports. And then a big one from an HR perspective is to make leaders lead instead of doing it for them, right? That HR is not getting too involved in certain things and then sort of taking authority and care away from leaders. I definitely, having been in frontline HR positions before, have been in situations where a leader's like, oh, I've got this person on my team. They're going through a tough time. I know, I'll just drop them off at Jane's office, right? They're essentially outsourcing caring to HR. And HR is there to support, and we're certainly there to connect people with resources and things like employee assistance and benefits and things like that. And we're there to coach leaders, but employees don't need to know that the nice HR person down the hall cares and has their back. I mean, it's nice to know HR cares, but nobody stays working somewhere where they're like, you know what, my boss is a jerk, but that HR lady down the hall, she's a delight. I'm going to stick it out for her, right? People stay somewhere and they stay engaged and connected because of their direct leader. So you can't outsource caring to somebody else. It's important that HR helps leaders lead and doesn't sort of overtake some of the things that leaders really should be doing. A couple actions to increase engagement, and then I'll go back to that question about leadership development programs. So number one, if you don't measure employee engagement today, I'd suggest you start measuring employee engagement. And depending on the size of your organization, that may be not a huge undertaking, or maybe it's a huge undertaking. But what I would say is, it can be simple. It does not have to be something that's going to get you 50 questions and a 100-page report. I mean, it can be that, but it can also be 12 questions or 10 questions that you've determined to be really important for your organization, right? It doesn't have to be overwhelming. But I think if you can, start measuring engagement. Based on the results of those engagement surveys, start providing leaders what they need to do better, right? So they're going to come out of this engagement survey hopefully knowing what they're doing well and what they need to work on. Well, now let's get you leadership coaching, let's get you training, let's make sure you have the time to be able to focus on your people so that we can really start and shift and change this. What that also means is that I do believe that the best employee engagement surveys are broken out by leader and by team. So you're going to get that big aggregate result that's maybe going to be shared with your whole organization. But I also believe results should be broken out by team and by leader. So each leader gets their own report, knowing where they stand. The only challenge there is you sometimes have to adjust how those results are shown if somebody has a really small team and we want to protect people's anonymity, right? So if somebody has a team of 2 people or 3 people, we might adjust how that report's given or how that feedback is given. But if somebody has a team of 5 or 10 or 12, then we have an opportunity to dig into the results there a little bit more. What's really important about this is if we're going to measure, then we measure again. We get our baseline with this first survey, and then we decide when the right time frame is to measure again. Maybe, if you're pretty agile, you're maybe looking at it again in 6 months or maybe a year, right? Or maybe a larger organization might undertake it every year or every 2 years. So if we're going to start doing this, recognize that it's going to be ongoing, that you also have to communicate about it, right? So those aggregate results come out. There's nothing more frustrating for employees to be filling out these surveys and then just never hear anything about them ever again. So share the results with employees at a high level, and also share what's happening, right? So, hey, these are the 2 things that were identified as our lowest scores. This is our plan, or these are some of the things we're working on to address those things, right? Even sometimes communicating before a survey. I have a couple of organizations I've worked with that sometimes feel like people don't always remember all of the things they've been doing over the course of a year to address last year's engagement results. So sometimes before the next survey, they'll communicate and they'll say, hey, remember last year's results? These are what the results were. These are the things we've done in response, right? And then people are reminded, oh yeah, they did get things done. They did action on some of this stuff. So these are some of the actions you can take from a leadership development perspective. There's a ton of great programs out there, and the one that I'm familiar with, I think people are from all over. I don't think this is like Calgary based, right? So I know in Calgary there's the Humphrey Group. My organization, Acuity HR, we offer leadership development, leadership training programs. We have an online version and an in-person version. But wherever you are or whatever it is you're looking for, I'm sure that if you Google, what's in your sort of local market, you'll come up with some pretty good solutions. I think there's a couple things that need to sort of happen. So for this question around leadership development programs, things that I would consider would be, is this a program where there's the opportunity to do ongoing coaching with somebody? Because I think that can be really helpful for leaders. Is this a program where there maybe is some sort of measurement of leadership effectiveness so that leaders going through the program have a baseline and know where they stand before or as they go through the training, so they can really apply it very specifically. People like John Maxwell, Dale Carnegie, they have big programs online that are available as well. But I also think ours at Acuity is pretty great too, but I'm obviously like a little bit partial there. So I like to share this quote with people as I sort of start finishing off on this presentation. It's from a woman named Susan Colantuono. She's has a TED Talk, and she says, leadership is using the greatness in you to achieve and sustain extraordinary outcomes by engaging the greatness in others. And so our job as leaders, our job as business owners, is to use the things that make us great, that our unique talents, our strengths, to bring out the very best in the people on our team. That's kind of what our job is as a leader. Now, I see that there might be another question here. I have one more just in the private chat that says, are there any tangible, specific things that the Acuity staff is doing during COVID to stay engaged with each other, if you're okay sharing? So that's a great question. What is our team doing? A couple things that we're doing that I think would be pretty standard but are meaningful is we just make sure that we are sticking to our regular meetings that we would have had in office. So, we have a regular Tuesday sort of standing meeting. We give a little bit more time to it now. It used to happen more in 45 minutes. I'd say now we're bordering a little more on an hour and a half, just because we're not getting those organic updates all throughout the week. We need a little bit more time to go through updates when we connect. In our organization, the leaders are working with their individual staff in a one-on-one at least once a week, that they're going through some sort of formal one-on-one process just to connect and see how people are doing. It's really interesting. I'll share a couple other things. So Brad, who's my boss, he had actually said to me at one point, he's like, oh, I think we need to do more like wine on, Thursday at 3 o'clock, get everybody on line for happy hour and that kind of thing. And I was like, we can do that, and we should do it from time to time. I'm like, but you know what is interesting? Our team in particular, our team has all of us have very robust outside sort of social networks. We love the work we do and we love each other. But I would say I am not a fan of forced fun. I don't love being forced to be like, we're all gonna be friends today and we're gonna go axe throwing or whatever. And I think for some teams that's great. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm not a fan of it. And so what I said to Brad was, I was like, what the real fun is in our workplace is the work itself. Let's find ways to bring out more fun in the actual work. I don't actually need the fun of going and doing these other things. I mean, if we want to do a bit of that, that's great. But what I want to do is find ways, where we all thrive and connect at work is when we get into the fun of the actual work itself, right? So I was like, I think we need to be booking more sort of collaborative input sessions as a team, right? We build a lot of presentations, we do a lot of this kind of stuff. And so, I've booked the team to get together to say hey, our 4-day leadership program, what could be better? What are we missing? What are the things we should be building into it? I have a bit of time this summer now. What should I be building into it, right? Getting everybody's input and feedback on that. Last week, we got together to talk about the concept of this whole COVID reset, and what does that look like for organizations, recognizing that all of us have an opportunity to kind of reset maybe our culture and our engagement and everything as we start to transition through this and transition forward, maybe to working in the office again or continuing with work from home. So getting people together to brainstorm, hey, so what's the reset? What would that presentation look like if we wanted to do that at some point? So I would say for your team, one of the things to consider is at work, what is fun for people, even in the work itself, and how can we help people collaborate and talk more about that? Keep to your meetings, keep connecting one-on-one. And if it makes sense, you can throw in some social things as well. You can throw in wine on a Thursday or something like that. I also think that getting involved in things like, United Way campaign, or if there's a charity or something that you support as an organization during this, that can be another way to sort of connect and engage people on something that might matter to them. So I hope that answers that question that came in. I'm just doing a quick look. I know we're at 1 o'clock here. I'm just doing a quick look at the chat. I don't think I've missed any questions, but I will open it up now to anybody else who has any other questions. And I've got a slide here just with my contact information. So if you're interested in connecting with me offline, or if you want to connect on LinkedIn or anything like that, please do. I'd love to connect with you, or if you want to sort of continue the conversation, happy to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. We really do appreciate that. And I will maybe just, as I'm talking, if anybody does have a question that they would like to ask, feel free to either shout that out or put it into the chat. But in the meantime, just to respect people's time, we'll just kind of start to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you for everybody for being here. Thank you, Jane. That was very insightful. I took a lot of notes, which I'll review in a bit. This will be up on our website. So watch for that in the next couple of days. The last one from Michael Kerr and Michelle Berg, they are up on our website now. So if you want to see those or share them, just go to the Hillcrest Financial website, click on the insights and scroll down, and you'll find not only that, but a lot of other really good stuff. Keep us in mind when you're going to different webinars and Zoom things. If there's something that you think would be a good one for us to be sharing with this group, do let us know. And just stay tuned for the next invitation. Also, stay tuned for our next Hillcrest at Home newsletter. It's going to be coming out very shortly. This one shines a bit of a light on Alex, our analyst, just a glimpse into her home life during this time. Jillian's also written a really insightful article on virtual health that you might want to look at. And there's a bit of an update on our Hillcrest team tomato growing contest, which admittedly only became a contest once I was securely in the lead. So a little bit of a spoiler there. So do watch for that in your inbox. And other than that, I haven't seen any other questions. So I think we'll pause and just let the meeting end, and then everybody can go for lunch. Thanks again, Jane. Thanks everybody else for being here, and please do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.